Okay, thank you everyone in the room and on Zoom so much for coming. I'm really excited to be able to talk about my dissertation work today. And the topic is understanding partisan bias in fake news belief and also fake news sharing. So to kind of start with the basics, click. According to Cambridge Dictionary, fake news are false stories that appear to be real news, spread on the internet or using other media, usually created to influence political views or as a joke. So as an example, here we have a Facebook post from Impeach Trump account from 2019, and they shared this news article saying Trump's grandfather was a pimp and tax evader. This was not true, so this is a piece of fake news, but it was shared more than 150,000 times on Facebook. So why is fake news an especially huge issue on social media? So one reason this is the case is because there's nearly 4 billion people worldwide who use social media. 4 in 5 Americans say they get at least some of their news from social media. And 64% of Americans say that fake news caused a great deal of confusion about current facts of basic events. Okay. So therefore, it has a large impact on fake news because there are a ton of people on social media who can be exposed to the fake news and get their news from social media. Okay, there is some work that suggests there's actually not that many fake news articles being shared on social media, and that most people on social media don't share fake news stories themselves, but you don't need a ton of people sharing it for it to have a large impact in the real world. So according to several polls, about 70% of Republican voters still suspect that the most recent American federal election was stolen by the Democrats. And this is despite the fact that potentially there weren't that many pieces about this of fake news online, and they weren't shared that frequently. Okay, so fake news, especially fake news such as this, that an election was stolen, for example, is a huge threat to democracy because it erodes our faith in democracy. Also, in general, fake news is a threat for democracy because we have to make really important political decisions as citizens of this democracy, such as voting decisions, on the ideally the same set of true facts. But fake news makes that difficult. Okay, and then finally, misinformation, such as, again, that the federal election was stolen in the US, can lead to really violent outcomes. So, for example, the Capitol insurrection. Therefore, it's really important to understand what factors affect belief in and sharing of fake news so we can reduce the spread of fake news and its impact. So therefore, for the purpose of my dissertation, I narrowed in on one such factor, and that was partisan bias. So my dissertation focused the effect of partisan bias in belief in and sharing of misinformation. For the purpose of my talk, I'm defining partisan bias as processing politically congruent information in a preferential way to incongruent information. And specifically for the case of the studies I'm going to talk about today, that means believing or sharing fake news that's positive about your in-group or negative about the out-group more than the opposite. Okay. So all that being said, here, dissertation, we're focusing on partisan bias. And for my dissertation, I have 3 chapters, and each one is a separate paper. So first, we have a partisan bias chapter. So this is the first chapter of my dissertation is an actual chapter from Cambridge Handbook of Political Psychology, where we talk about partisanship as a social identity and the different domains in which partisan bias can have an effect. In paper 2, I talk about partisan bias and belief updating when it comes to misinformation. And then in chapter 3, I have some empirical work looking at partisan bias and willingness to share fake news. And also I look at the effect of age on sharing fake news. Okay, so to start with our chapter on partisanship. So according to social identity theory, so Tajfel and Turner, etc., people are prone to form social groups. So a collection of individuals who categorize themselves as similar to each other, but different from others on some dimension, and develop a feeling of attachment towards these groups. Further, they can enhance their own personal self-esteem by identifying with groups that they think are better than relevant outgroups. So there's growing evidence that members of political groups harbor many of the same tendencies inherent in this kind of basic level social identity. In the domain of politics, these basic tendencies to identify with groups are amplified by things like competition for scarce resources, such as elections, where there can only be one political party that wins, amplified by different moral values between the parties, and amplified by the fact that partisanship seems to intersect with other identities, such as race, religion, and national identity. Okay. As such, social identity is a core feature of partisanship. So next in this chapter, I talked about different arenas in which we may see an effect of partisan bias, and here I focus on belief and sharing of fake news, since that's the most relevant to this talk. So one key factor in the belief and dissemination of misinformation appears to be partisanship. So for example, this is some of my prior work on this topic, and here what we found. So on the y-axis, we have belief judgments and how much they believe the particular news story from 1 to 7. On the x-axis, we have the political affiliation of the politician in the story. So whether it was a Democrat doing something negative in this fake news story or a Republican doing something negative. And then the two panels are our Democrat participants and our Republican participants here. And what we found was that Democrats believed negative news stories about Republicans significantly more than about Democrats, which is a significant partisan bias in belief for Democrats. And we found the opposite thing in Republicans. So Republicans were more willing to believe negative news stories about Democrats compared to Republicans. Okay, and in this chapter, we also talk briefly about biological roots of partisanship. So recent work suggests that some personality traits are heritable, stable, and difficult to change. And so some of these personality traits likely shape our partisanship. So for example, twin studies have found that genetic influences account for roughly 40% of the variation in political ideologies, which is a huge chunk of the variation. Further, there's multiple areas of the brain involved in partisanship or processes related to partisanship. So for example, the lateral prefrontal cortex is negatively correlated with strength of partisan affiliation for our participant. So in summary, there is a growing literature that suggests that partisanship is a form of social identity with interesting and wide-reaching implications for both our brains and our behavior. So in some ways, the effect of partisanship mirror forms of other group identity, both behaviorally and in the brain. However, partisanship also has interesting biological causes and effects in partisan or political domains, such as belief in fake news, belief in conspiracy theories, and voting behavior. Okay, moving on to chapter 2, where I'm going to be talking about empirical evidence for partisan bias in belief and partisan bias in belief updating. So our research question for my second paper here was, do Americans update their belief, fail to update, or backfire, depending on the source of a correction, and then in parentheses there on Twitter. So to kind of break that question down, what we had participants do was they read a fake news story and rated how much they believed it to be true. They saw a correction to that news story, and then they read the original fake news story again and were asked to re-rate their belief. So there's only three possibilities here. So either they update their beliefs, so they believe the initial fake news even less after seeing a correction compared to before seeing the correction. They fail to update or stay the same, so they believe the initial fake news the same amount after seeing a correction to it than before. Or they do what's called backfiring, which is when they believe the initial fake news even more after having seen it corrected compared to before seeing it corrected. Okay, so we're interested in what our American samples did on average. We're also interested in whether what they did depended on the source of a correction. So whether the correction itself came from a political in-group member or a political out-group member. Finally, I'm most interested in fake news in a social media context. So what we did was we made all of our stimuli look like tweets, so both the fake news and the corrections. And this is a really ecologically valid context because there's nearly 2 million people on Twitter worldwide, and also many prominent politicians have Twitter accounts. And as you'll see in study 1 and 2 in this package, we made the tweets look like they came from politicians. Okay, so all of that being said, our hypothesis was participants will update their belief for all corrections. So we believe that overall, regardless of who the correction came from, people would believe the initial fake news less after seeing a correction compared to before seeing a correction, but more so when the correction comes from an in-group member versus an out-group member. So this would be the definition of a partisan bias in belief updating. Okay, so starting with study 1, participants would see an original tweet that came from either a well-known Democratic politician or a well-known Republican politician. And they'd be asked on a scale from 1 to 100, to what extent do you believe this statement? They would then see a correction tweet, which specifically in study 1 always came from the opposite party. So if the original misinformation came from a Democrat, it was always corrected by a Republican and vice versa. Then participants would see the two tweets side by side and would be asked about that original tweet or the first tweet you saw, which is now shown above, on a scale from 1 to 100. Again, to what extent do you believe this statement? Okay, and as an example stimuli, here we have Lindsey Graham, who's a prominent Republican politician, saying something about military spending. And in this particular trial, he's being corrected by Hillary Clinton. We also have Barack Obama saying something that's not true about military funding, and here he's being corrected by Donald Trump. So what did we find? So here on the y-axis, we have their belief judgments from 0 to 100. On the x-axis, we have time. So we have their belief judgments before seeing the correction and after seeing the correction. And then you can also see in my little legend here, we're going to have a green line, which are all the trials in which the initial misinformation came from an out-group member, and pink when it came from an in-group member. Okay, and this is what we found. So the first thing we can see is a huge effect of partisan bias in belief, which was not part of the hypotheses, just because that's something I alluded to before. I've already found that in previous work, so this is a replication of that. And so we found this huge effect. I think it was a Cohen's d of like 1.2. And so people would believe the initial fake news that came from in-group members significantly more than when it came from out-group members. We also found that both of these slopes were significantly negative, or in other words, regardless of who the correction came from, people did update their belief. Very little on our scale, but they did update their belief and believe the initial fake news a little bit less after seeing a correction, regardless of whether the correction came from an in-group or out-group member. The last thing is we did not find that this green line was significantly steeper than the pink line, which is what we expected. So that would have been partisan bias and belief updating. So the correction, they did not update, especially more when the correction came from an in-group member compared to when it came from an out-group member. It may not have existed in this study, or it's possibly due to our floor effect here. So we found that a lot of people believed the initial fake news from out-group politicians at 0 at time 1. So regardless of the fact the correction came from an in-group member, they couldn't go any lower on the scale. So they had to fail to update and stay at 0. Okay, but in summary, we found partisan bias and belief. We found that overall people updated their belief, and we found no partisan bias and belief updating. Okay, so the biggest issue here, or the way that we thought to get around this floor effect, was to unyoke the source of the original tweeter and the correction tweeter. So in other words, a Democrat could correct a fellow Democrat, a Republican could correct a fellow Republican, etc. Another couple changes we made in study 2 is we use less well-known politicians. So here we have Tom Perez, who is a Democratic National Committee member, and we also used Republican National Committee members. And then the third change is we added a neutral source as well. So here, those were nonpartisan organizations. So here we have Tom Perez saying something untrue about ICE, and he can be corrected. Should I let them in? Okay. Echo? Okay. So Tom Perez here, who's a DNC member, a Democrat, could be corrected by an RNC member. So like here, Ronna McDaniel, he could be corrected by a fellow DNC member. So for example, Karen Carter Peterson, or he could be corrected by a nonpartisan organization such as Pew Research Center. Okay, so what did we find in study 2? So here, again, on the y-axis is belief from 0 to 100. Again, on the x-axis is time, so belief judgments before seeing a correction and after seeing a correction. And then we have in the legend the source of the original misinformation. Since that was unyoked from the corrector source, we now also have these 3 panels. So starting with the first panel, these are all the trials in which the correction comes from an in-group member. And what we found is this. So the first thing we see is, again, a large partisan bias in belief. So people did believe fake news from their political in-group members significantly more than fake news from their political out-group members. We also found that all these lines were significantly negative, meaning that when the correction comes from an in-group member, people did update their beliefs significantly. For when the correction came from a nonpartisan organization, we found the same pattern. And then we found a similar pattern when the correction came from an outgroup member. So here we again see a partisan bias and belief. And we also see that even when the correction comes from a political outgroup member, people do believe the fake news less after seeing a correction compared to before seeing the correction. However, unlike in study 1, we did find support for the partisan bias and belief updating. So we can see that here by seeing that here these lines are significantly steeper than these lines, meaning that people did update more when the correction came from a political in-group member compared to a political out-group member. So in summary, we found a partisan bias and belief, overall updating, and partisan bias and belief updating. Okay. And then finally, we also had a third study. It was very similar in procedure to study 2, but this time our sources were co-partisan Twitter users. So the way we operationalized that is we made Twitter accounts that looked like Trump fan accounts. So these were our Republican users. We made accounts that looked like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez fan accounts. So these were our Democratic Twitter users. And we also stated at the beginning of the study that that's what they were. The Trump fan accounts were Republicans and the AOC fan accounts were Democrats. And then our neutral case, we had Twitter users that had no political affiliation stated in their profile, such as Mac. Okay. Okay, so as an example stimuli, here we have AOC Queen. So an AOC fan account or a Democrat saying something that's not true about Planned Parenthood, and they're being corrected by God's Guns and Trump. So a Trump fan account. So a Republican Twitter user. Okay, and again, any source could correct any source. Okay, so what did we find? The plot is identical to that of study 2. It's just now that we have these co-partisan Twitter users instead. So this is what we found. Here we see, again, a significant partisan bias and belief. People did believe the misinformation from political in-group members, political co-partisans, significantly more than they did the political out-group members. Overall, these 3 lines are significantly negative in slope, which means that people did update their belief when they saw a correction from a political in-group member. So they believed less after seeing the correction. We found the same pattern when the correction came from a non-affiliated Twitter user or a neutral Twitter user. And we found, again, the same pattern when the correction came from an outgroup, a political outgroup member. So unlike in study 2, panels on the slopes in panel 1 were not significantly steeper than the slopes in panel 3, meaning we did not find evidence of a partisan bias and belief updating when these sources were co-partisans as opposed to politicians. Okay, so in summary, we found a partisan bias and belief. We found that overall people updated their belief regardless of the correction source, and we found no partisan bias and belief updating. So as a little summary chart here, we found partisan bias and belief across all 3 studies. We found that across all 3 studies, people updated their beliefs. And we found only in study 2, a effect of partisan bias and belief updating. So as a little summary statement, people tend to update their beliefs when they see a correction overall, but less so when the correction comes from an out-group politician compared to an in-group politician. But this was not the case for co-partisans. Okay, also another focus of the paper that I don't have time to get into here is we also look at the backfire effect. So we looked at how many trials across all of our studies featured a backfire effect, so people believing more after seeing the correction compared to before seeing the correction. This was in study or experiment 1. We found that across 26% of our trials, people backfired. Study 2, it was about 20% of trials. In study 3, it was about 25% of trials. So even though when we look at aggregate data, we don't see people backfiring because it's the minority of cases in which people backfire, it was still definitely going on. So the next step is we wanted to create a model testing what factors might increase the likelihood of someone backfiring. And this is what we found. So first and foremost, we found that when the correction comes from an out-group member and the initial source of misinformation was an in-group member, those are the trials in which people were most likely to backfire, which makes sense. Just in study 2, but not in studies 1 and 3, we found that people who are more identified with their political party were more likely to backfire. And then also across all 3 studies, we found that for some topics versus others, people were more likely to backfire, although we haven't looked into that yet to find out why that might be the case. Just as an example, in study 3, we found people were more likely to backfire when the tweets were about climate change as opposed to like military spending. Okay. Great, so that is a summary of my second chapter, or my second paper. And then lastly, there's my third paper. So here I looked at the effect of partisanship or partisan bias on sharing political misinformation, and also looked at the effect of age. So as a brief introduction, research suggests that older adults, so those 65 plus, share about 7 times more fake news on social media than the youngest adults. And there's a lot of debate in the literature about why this might be the case. So one possible explanation that I'm most interested in was partisanship. So there are a growing number of older Republican voters, and prior work finds that conservatives share more fake news than liberals. Therefore, maybe the reason it seems like older adults share more fake news than younger adults is driven by conservatives. So this little intro leads directly to my first research question, which was, is the effect of aging only or larger in Republicans compared to Democrats? So that kind of gets at the magnitude of misinformation shared, the amount of misinformation shared, but I was also interested in what types of misinformation were being shared, specifically, of course, partisan bias in sharing. So my following 2 questions were, do older Republicans show more partisan bias in their sharing than Democrats? And the reason I asked that was because that's the pattern I found with younger adults. So I was interested in whether that also existed in older adults. And then second, do older adults show more partisan bias in their sharing judgments than younger adults? Okay, so to address these questions, in study 1, I have access to a large data set with real Facebook sharing behavior and also demographic information. So here we hypothesized that older adults will share more misinformation than younger adults, which would be a replication of the literature, and predict that this effect will be larger in Republicans. In study 2, I predicted that older adults will show a partisan bias in their willingness to share fake news, and that Republicans would show more of a bias than Democrats. Thereby, if I found this, I'd be replicating the pattern that I also found in a sample of younger adults. And then in study 3, I predicted that partisan bias would be larger in older adults compared to younger adults. Okay, so starting with study 1. So here on the y-axis, we have proportion of fake news shares. So what that means is that for every participant, I had the number of fake news articles they shared and the number of articles they shared in general, and I divided them to get this proportion of the articles they shared that were fake news. On the x-axis, we have a continuous variable of age, and then we're going to see 3 different colored lines / dots, and that's the party identification or the partisanship of the participant in the study. Okay. This is what we found. So what we found was across everyone, older adults were more willing to share fake news than younger adults. So this is replicating the finding in the literature, but we did not find that this effect was larger in Republicans compared to Democrats. There were no significant differences in the effect size between either Democrats, Republicans, or independents. This suggests that partisanship is not one of the explanatory factors in the effect of increased age leading to increased sharing. Okay. And then experiments 2 and 3 to get at our second research question. Experiments 2 and 3 were identical, and the only difference was that experiment 2 featured only older adults, and experiment 3 had a sample of both older and younger adults. In these experiments, the participants would see a series of fake news stories. So here we have a Republican politician committing some kind of transgression, a Democratic politician committing some kind of transgression, or a politician without their affiliation stated, committing some kind of transgression. And then for each one, on a scale from 1 to 7, how likely are you to share this news story? So all participants saw 3 stories. Okay, so experiment 2, when we only had the elderly sample, this is what we found. There. Okay, this is what we found. First thing that we can see here when we have the full scale is that we see that people were not very willing to share the fake news stories, which is great. People were saying about a 1 or a 2 on our 7-point scale when they're saying how willing they'd be to share this online. Zooming in a little bit, still hard to see, but there is a significant, that's where the red circle is supposed to go. There is a significant partisan bias in Republicans here. So in other words, over here, Republicans were significantly more willing to share negative news stories about Democrats compared to negative news stories about Republicans. the same effect was trending in Democrats in the right direction, but it was not significant. So here the results are exactly what we predicted. So we replicated the same pattern that we found in younger adults and found that older adults also show partisan bias and willingness to share, but this effect is larger in Republicans compared to Democrats. Okay, and then we had study 3 here. So here we had older and younger adults in the same plot, and this is what we found. So here we have sharing judgments from 1 to 7. We have the political affiliation of the participant, and we have the political affiliation of the transgressor. So here a little bit more clearly, we can see that the Republicans are significantly more willing to share negative news about Democrats compared to negative news about Republicans. So they show a partisan bias in their willingness to share judgments, but this was not significant in Democrats. Okay, also, the final question was, do older adults show more partisan bias in general compared to younger adults? And this was not the case. Okay, so in summary, in study 1, we found that all older adults share more misinformation than younger adults. So this is not what we predicted. The effect was not larger in Republicans compared to Democrats. In study 2, we found that older Republicans show a partisan bias and willingness to share fake news more so than older Democrats, which is what we predicted. And then in study 3, we did not find an effect of age on partisan bias, unlike what we predicted. Okay, to recap my entire dissertation, in chapter 1, we talked about partisanship as a social identity and the different domains of partisan bias. In chapter 2, I provided empirical evidence for a partisan bias in belief in misinformation and a nuanced partisan bias in belief updating, just for politicians and not for co-partisans. And then in chapter 3, we found evidence of a partisan bias and willingness to share in older adults. In some of my previous work, found this in younger adults. But we did not find more or less partisan bias in older adults compared to younger adults. Okay. And then lastly, partisanship was not a potential explanation for the effect of age on sharing fake news. So as key takeaways, as outlined in my first chapter, chapters 2 and 3 are empirical work providing evidence that, like other social identities, partisanship biases are information processing, specifically belief updating, and sharing. This is especially important and concerning in the realm of fake information or fake news, because it's a huge threat to democracy, again, because we have to make voting decisions, ideally on the same set of true facts. Also, partisan bias can lead Democrats and Republicans to believe completely opposite things. So we can have Democrats believing fake news that's negative about Republicans, Republicans believing fake news that's negative about Democrats, and this is just going to lead to increased polarization. And then finally, as I've said at the beginning, fake news can encourage political violence. So with that, I'm going to thank all of my collaborators and my funding sources, and thank my lab, my cohort, my friends at the department, my best friend, my family, my boyfriend, and also my emotional support cats. Thank you.